She saw him in the marble lobby, lost in a worn coat and scuffed shoes. She nearly offered directions, sure he'd wandered in by mistake. Then the manager straightened and said, "Welcome back, sir. Your penthouse is ready." He wasn't a lost visitor. He owned the hotel and everyone across the state. That moment, her assumptions crumbled. The man in the worn coat was John Matherson. He owned not just that hotel, but a chain of 32 luxury properties across the state. His net worth exceeded $800 million, and yet he chose to dress like a retired school teacher deliberately. Why? Because decades earlier, he had been the one judged by his cover, and he never forgot it. What happened next would expose the invisible divide between those who see and those who only look. But to understand that moment, you have to go back to where it all began. John Matherson was born on the wrong side of a town that didn't even have a right side. His mother cleaned rooms at a small motor lodge off the interstate. His father disappeared before John turned 3. From the age of 7, he would sit in the empty lobby after school, doing homework on a cracked vinyl chair while his mother scrubbed other people's messes. The guests never noticed him. The manager called him a distraction and told him to stay out of sight. He learned early that a person who looks poor is either invisible or a problem. But one afternoon, when he was 10, a guest in an expensive suit came storming to the front desk. He pointed at John and accused him of stealing his wallet. The man's wife stood behind him, clutching her purse. The manager didn't ask questions. He dragged John into the back office and searched his pockets. There was nothing. The wallet was later found in the couple's own car. The man muttered something about the boy looking suspicious and walked away without an apology. John's mother held him that night and told him that some people see only what they want to see. But John had already burned those words into his memory. He didn't want to be seen differently. He wanted to become the person who decides what everyone else sees. By 16, John was working 2 jobs. He washed dishes, stocked shelves, saved every dollar. He didn't buy new clothes because he needed the money for something else. He had noticed that the most powerful men in town were the ones who owned land and buildings. So he started studying real estate from library books, attending free seminars, cold-calling property owners. At 22, he bought a rundown motel on the edge of foreclosure with a down payment scraped together from years of manual labor. The bank almost refused because he looked too young and too rough, but the numbers didn't lie. Within 3 years, that motel was turning a profit that his critics hadn't expected. Then he bought another, then a small hotel, then another. By 35, John Matherson owned 12 properties and his name was whispered in business circles. But he still drove a second-hand truck and wore the same kind of plain coat his mother used to buy at thrift stores. He wasn't being humble. He was running an experiment on human nature. You see, after that incident in the motor lodge as a child, John developed a quiet obsession. He wanted to know exactly how people treat a man they think has nothing. So he made it a practice to walk through his own hotels unannounced, dressed as a nobody. He would stand in the lobby, sit at the bar, ask for directions. He watched who was polite, who was dismissive, who saw a potential customer, and who saw a threat. He promoted the ones who treated him kindly. He fired the ones who sneered. Over time, his employees learned a strange lesson. You never know who the man in the corner really is. But the outside world hadn't learned that. And one person in particular still carried a grudge from decades earlier, though she didn't know the boy she once accused had become the man whose hotel she was about to enter. The woman's name was Diane Ashford. 35 years earlier, she was the wife of the man who accused a 10-year-old John of stealing his wallet. She had stood by silently, nodding along, her expression more concerned with her own comfort than with the truth. She probably forgot the incident within a week, but John never forgot her face. It was etched into his memory, along with the smell of the cheap cleaning solution his mother used and the sting of being called a liar before he even understood what justice meant. Diane Ashford's life had taken a downward turn. Her husband died, the money dried up, and she had been drifting through small jobs for years. Now, by pure coincidence, she had applied for a secretarial position at the Matherson Imperial Hotel, the crown jewel of John's empire. She was called in for an interview on a Tuesday afternoon, The same day, John decided to stop by and review the new hearing protocols in person. He came through the revolving doors in his usual attire, a worn tweed jacket, scuffed leather shoes, a slight limp from a construction accident years ago. He looked exactly like a man who had wandered in to use the restroom. The front desk clerk didn't recognize him. He was a new hire. The assistant manager, who might have known his face, was in the back office. John stood near the grand piano, taking in the scent of fresh flowers and polished brass, a world away from the cracked vinyl of his childhood. And then Diane Ashford walked into the lobby. She was older now, with gray in her hair and a nervous, hurried gait. She saw John standing there, looking lost, clutching a scuffed briefcase. She assumed he was a job applicant or a homeless man seeking warmth. She felt a flicker of irritation and the old arrogance she had never fully shed. She walked past him without a word, heading toward the reception desk. But John had already seen her. The boy inside him froze, and then something inside him shifted from memory to purpose. He didn't confront her. He simply stood there, watching as she approached the clerk. She asked about her interview, voice apologetic, trying to smooth the wrinkles in her dress. The clerk, with practiced politeness, handed her a clipboard and told her to wait. She sat down on a velvet sofa not 10 feet from the man she had once helped condemn. She didn't look at him. And in that moment, John Matherson made a decision that would test everything he had built, not just his fortune, but the very code he claimed to live by. The lobby was about to become a courtroom, and only he knew who was on trial. John Matherson didn't move from his spot near the grand piano. He watched Diane Ashford settle onto the velvet sofa, her fingers nervously smoothing her dress, the clipboard balanced on her knee. She didn't know it, but every detail of her behavior was being logged. John had built an empire not just on property values, but on pattern recognition. And the pattern he saw in the woman across the lobby was hauntingly familiar. 35 years had passed, yet the same tightness around her mouth, the same quick, assessing glance she gave the other guests, the same way she ignored the only person in the room who looked like he didn't belong. That person was him. He decided to run the oldest test in his playbook. He walked up to her slowly, allowing his limp to show, and put on a slightly confused expression. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you. Could you tell me where the restroom is?" Diane looked up from her clipboard, and for a fraction of a second something flickered in her eyes. Not recognition, dismissal. She scanned his worn jacket, his scuffed shoes, and the briefcase that held nothing but old newspapers. Then she pointed vaguely toward a hallway without making eye contact. "Down there, through the restaurant." No please, no smile, just a gesture meant to move the problem away from her. John thanked her and walked in that direction, but he didn't go far. He doubled back and stood by the concierge desk where he could still see her. Not 3 minutes later, a well-dressed businessman walked through the same lobby, looking genuinely lost. He was in a tailored navy suit, carrying a leather laptop case. He approached Diane, who was still waiting, and asked her the exact same question. Her entire posture changed. She smiled warmly, stood up, and gave detailed directions. She even offered to walk him to the corridor leading to the facilities. She laughed at a small joke he made about confusing hotel layouts. She was charming, deferential, and eager. The businessman went on his way, and Diane sat back down, her expression settling back into self-absorption. John felt the old scar burn. The test was conclusive. The woman who once stood silently while a boy was falsely accused had not changed. She had simply learned to polish her mask. But John wasn't finished. He wanted to know if her core was rotten or just her surface. He pulled out his phone and texted the hotel's general manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Cole who had worked for him for over a decade. The message read, "The applicant in the lobby, run the enhanced interview protocol. I'll be in the observation room. Do not acknowledge me." Patricia knew exactly what that meant. She had been trained to test character under pressure. She came out, greeted Diane professionally, and led her into a private office that was fitted with discreet cameras and a one-way mirror. John entered the observation room next door where he could watch and hear everything. The lights were off, the room silent. He slipped on a headset that fed the audio directly into his ears. Patricia began the interview as usual. She asked about Diane's work history, her clerical skills, her experience with scheduling and phone systems. Diane answered smoothly, presenting herself as a competent, reliable widow who had fallen on hard times through no fault of her own. She mentioned a few jobs, but her resume had gaps she couldn't convincingly fill. Patricia let those slide for the moment. Then she shifted tone. "Mrs. Ashford, we pride ourselves on integrity here at the Matherson Imperial. Can you tell me about a time when you faced an ethical dilemma at work and how you handled it?" Diane hesitated for just a beat. John leaned forward. She gave a rehearsed answer about a coworker who was stealing office supplies and how she had reported it discreetly to management. It sounded clean, too clean. Patricia nodded, jotting notes. Then she asked a more pointed question. "Have you ever been accused of misconduct yourself, or witnessed an accusation against someone else that you later discovered was false?" The room seemed to hold its breath. John's eyes didn't blink. Diane's smile faltered for a second, but she recovered with a soft, sad smile. "No, nothing like that. I've always been very careful to avoid trouble. Life is hard enough without inviting scandal." The lie hung in the air like smoke. John felt a cold anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay still. He had waited this long. He could wait a little longer. Patricia continued for another 10 minutes, then she paused and looked at her notes as if receiving a sudden message. In truth, John had sent her another text. "Ask about the Motor Lodge, theft accusation, 35 years ago." Patricia glanced at the one-way mirror, a subtle signal that she understood. "One more thing," Patricia said, closing the file. "We run a deep background screening for all potential employees. It's not just credit scores. We contact former employers, associates, and we cross-reference legal records. Is there anything in your past, even something minor, that might come up and surprise us, even if it was dismissed or you were found innocent?" Now Diane's composure cracked just slightly. Her fingers tightened on the armrest. She licked her lips and looked away. I don't think so," she said. "I've never been in any legal trouble." Patricia pressed gently. "Not even as a witness? Not even something that happened in a public place?" Diane's face went a shade paler. She mumbled, "There was an incident a long time ago at a motor lodge. My late husband accused a boy of stealing his wallet. It was a misunderstanding. The wallet was found later. I barely remember it. I wasn't involved." Patricia's voice was calm steel. "And did you speak up at the time? Did you defend the boy?" Diane's throat moved as she swallowed. "My husband was a difficult man. You didn't contradict him. That boy, he was probably fine. I'm sure he turned out fine." John removed the headset. He had heard enough. He walked out of the observation room and made his way around the corridor to the office door. He didn't knock. He opened it and stepped inside. Diane Ashford turned, her mouth opening to protest the interruption, and then she froze. She didn't recognize the face, but she recognized the eyes. The same dark, steady eyes of the 10-year-old boy who had stood in that shabby lobby, bewildered, while her husband's hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Hello, Diane," John said. "My name is John Matherson. I own this hotel and 32 others. And 35 years ago you stood there and let your husband call me a thief." Diane's face contorted through shock, confusion, and then sheer panic. She looked at Patricia, who had risen and stood quietly by the wall, then back at John. You're not, that can't be." Her voice was a ragged whisper. John took a step closer. He was not shouting. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room like an incoming tide. "You didn't speak for me. You didn't say a word. You went back to your room, your husband had his wallet, and I went home crying to my mother, who never forgot the shame. And now you're here asking to work in my hotel, and you still can't tell the truth." For a long, painful moment, Diane said nothing. Then her eyes welled up and her face crumpled. But it wasn't remorse that poured out. It was a torrent of self-pity. "You don't understand," she cried, twisting a tissue in her hands. "My husband was a brute. He controlled everything I did. He would have beat me if I contradicted him. I was a prisoner in my own life. I've suffered enough. I lost everything after he died. I'm not that woman anymore." John's jaw tightened. The justification was perfectly calibrated to disarm him. And for a heartbeat he felt that old instinct to forgive, the reflex of a man who had been forgiven himself. But then he remembered the way she had dismissed him in the lobby just minutes ago, when there was no husband, no threat, only a man in a worn coat who needed help. That wasn't fear. That was who she was when no one was watching. Patricia stepped forward and placed a document on the table. It was a court record from 11 years earlier. A small claims case in which Diane Ashford, as plaintiff, accused a handyman of stealing a watch from her apartment. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence, but the handyman had been fired from his job and evicted by his landlord because of the accusation. The pattern repeated. John's voice was low. You didn't just stand by once. You accused another innocent person yourself. You don't change, Diane. You just find new people to destroy. Diane's tears dried abruptly. Her eyes became hard, calculating. She looked from John to Patricia and then back at John. You think you've won. You're just a jumped-up janitor with a lucky streak. Your mother scrubbed toilets out of desperation. I know things about her. Things that, if they get out, will make your fancy hotels look like a criminal enterprise. John's blood ran cold, but he didn't show it. What are you talking about? He said. Diane leaned forward, voice dripping with malice. Your mother, the saint who raised you. After that wallet incident, my husband looked into her. He found out she had a record. Petty theft years before you were born. She served 6 months. She lied about it to get work at the Motor Lodge. The boy they accused of stealing, that was you, and your mother, the ex-con, had every reason to teach her son the same tricks. The room went absolutely silent. Patricia looked at John, whose face was unreadable. Diane sat back, triumphant. So go ahead, Mr. Matherson. Have me escorted out. Tell the press about the poor widow you humiliated. I'll make sure every headline in this city reads, Billionaire Hotelier's mother was a convicted thief. See what that does to your precious legacy. John's mind raced. He knew nothing of this. His mother had never spoken about any conviction. And yet there was a tiny, sharp worry. His mother had always been secretive about her early years. Could it be true? And if it was, would it matter? His whole identity was built on the narrative of an innocent child dragged through the mud by people like Diane. If his mother had a criminal past, Diane could twist the story to paint him as a fraud, a hypocrite. But the greater danger was that even if it was a lie, the accusation itself could be a weapon. In the court of public opinion, the truth was often less important than the spectacle. He looked at Diane, and for the first time he saw not a pitiful relic of his past, but a strategic threat. She had nothing left to lose, and people with nothing left are the most dangerous kind of opponent. The interview, the lobby, the whole experiment had just flipped from a personal reckoning into a crisis that could shake his entire empire. The young journalist in the hotel bar, a reporter from the Chronicle who had been sniffing around about elitism in luxury hotels, suddenly became a ticking bomb. If she got hold of this story before John could shape it, the damage would be catastrophic. He gestured for Patricia to wait. Then he looked Diane dead in the eye. You're not leaving this hotel until we settle this, he said. You want a war, let's talk terms. Diane smiled, thin and sharp. Now you're speaking my language. The door clicked shut behind them, and in that sealed room, the courtroom John had imagined transformed into a cage. The moral high ground he had stood on was shifting beneath his feet. And it wasn't just his reputation at stake anymore. It was his mother's name, the very foundation of the boy who swore he'd never be invisible again. The door clicked shut, and John Matherson stood in the silent corridor with Patricia Cole. Neither spoke for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the faint scent of Diane's floral perfume still clung to the air. John's mind was a storm of images. His mother's tired smile, the scratchy blanket on his childhood bed, the crack in her voice when she told him that some people see only what they want to see. Was she hiding something darker beneath that kindness? Patricia finally broke the silence. Sir, I've never heard anything about your mother having a record. She's revered in this company. Every executive knows the story of the woman who cleaned rooms and taught you dignity. That accusation could be totally fabricated. John nodded. But if it's not, we need to know before she does. Get Marcus on the phone. Now. Marcus was John's private counsel, a former federal prosecutor who had built a career out of killing scandals before they hatched. John explained the situation without emotion, as if reviewing a property dispute. Marcus listened and then said, I'll pull the records and have a confidential investigator dig. Give me 3 hours. John hung up and turned to Patricia. Keep Diane in the hospitality suite. Treat her like a guest, not a prisoner. I want full surveillance on her communications. If she contacts the press, I need to know before the story drops." Within an hour, the hotel's security team had isolated the landline in her suite and put a trace on her cell phone records. John retreated to his private office on the top floor, a room lined with photos of the motel he first bought, his mother standing proudly beside the sign. He stared at her face. She had always been a fortress of quiet strength, but he realized he knew almost nothing about her life before he was born. She never spoke of it. She would say, "The past is a locked door." I threw away the key. He had always assumed she meant a broken marriage or a lost love. Could it have been a prison cell? At midnight, Marcus called back. The investigator had found court documents from 47 years ago. A 22-year-old woman named Maria Kessler was arrested for stealing cash and jewelry from a guest at a boarding house where she worked. She was convicted of petty larceny and served 6 months in a county correctional facility. The name Maria Kessler was John's mother's maiden name. She had changed her surname to Matherson after marrying John's father, a man who left shortly after. The evidence was thin back then. The boarding house owner claimed she'd confessed, but Maria herself wrote in an appeal, later denied, that the owner forced a false confession to cover up a family member's theft. The appeal was lost in bureaucracy. There was no further record of the crime after her release. John's hands were cold. His mother, the woman who told him to hold his head high no matter what, had been a convicted thief, even if unjustly. The narrative Diane could spin was clear. Billionaire preaches integrity while his mother was a criminal. The press wouldn't care about nuances. They'd see hypocrisy. The journalist in the hotel bar, a hungry young reporter named Renee Voss, had already posted a social media query asking if anyone had tips about the undercover billionaire and his treatment of a job applicant. The flame was lit. But then came the first twist. At 2 in the morning, Patricia buzzed John's intercom. "Sir, you need to see this." She directed him to a live feed from the security camera in Diane's suite. Diane was on her cell phone packing, and the audio feed, tapped with Marcus's court-approved surveillance order, was crystal clear. "I did it just like you said," Diane was saying, voice tight with excitement. "He's scared, I can tell. He's got his lawyers digging. The bait is set." A man's voice replied, deep and oily. "Good. Move to phase 2. Contact the reporter. Tell her you have documents that prove Maria Matherson's criminal past. Leak that John physically threatened you during the interview. I want a story by tomorrow evening. Once the stock dips, Clifford Holdings will make the hostile takeover bid. You'll get $2 million and a luxury condo." John's blood turned to ice. Diane wasn't just a resentful widow seeking revenge. She was a paid operative. Clifford Holdings was a rival hotel conglomerate run by Aldrich Finch, a ruthless corporate raider who had tried and failed to buy John's chain 3 years earlier. Finch had apparently dug up Diane, weaponized her personal history, and turned her loose in John's lobby with the precision of a guided missile. John now faced a legal, financial, and personal catastrophe in one package. If the story broke with that narrative, a billionaire physically intimidating a poor elderly woman who only wanted a job, his reputation would shatter. The truth of the wallet incident, the lobby test, none of that would matter in the first news cycle. By the time he could release the full context, the damage would be done. The board of his own company might even force him out to salvage shareholder value. He gave Marcus the update. "We need to neutralize this. Can we sue for defamation?" Marcus sighed. "We can, but a lawsuit takes months. By then, the PR crisis is over. We need to get ahead of the story. Tell your side first on your own platform." An idea began to form in John's mind. He had spent his entire life trying to prove that the man in the worn coat was the judge, not the judged. The lobby test, the experiment, all of it. He had thought he was teaching the world a lesson. But in reality, he was still the scared boy seeking vindication. This moment required not just a defensive maneuver, but a full public embrace of the very vulnerability Diane wanted to use against him. He spent the next 6 hours in a conference room with his communications team, his lawyers, and Patricia. They watched the clock like a bomb timer. At 9 in the morning, Renee Voss published a preliminary article on the Chronicle's website. Hotel mogul John Matherson accused of harassing elderly widow amid mother's criminal history. It was sourced entirely from Diane and an anonymous company insider. The stock opened 12 points down. John's phone exploded. Board members demanded an emergency meeting. The mayor's office called the tourism board, even the governor's press secretary. John told them all the same thing. I'll have a statement by noon, trust me. He then did something no one expected. He called Aldrich Finch directly. Finch answered after 2 rings, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. John, I've been reading the news, such a shame. If you want to sell, I could take this problem off your hands, save you the embarrassment. John's voice was calm. Aldrich, you think you found my weakness, but you've made a mistake. You forced me to tell a story I kept hidden for 40 years, and that story will bury you. Finch laughed. I doubt that. Good luck, boy. John hung up. He then placed another call to his childhood friend, a documentary filmmaker named Alex Rojas, who had wanted to produce a biopic on John's life for years. John had always refused. Now he asked Alex to come to the hotel with a full camera crew within the hour. At noon, John walked into the hotel's grand ballroom, which had been converted into a press conference venue. Every major news outlet in the state was there. Renee Voss sat in the front row, notebook poised. Diane Ashford was not present, but her ghost commanded the room. John stood at the podium in the same worn tweed jacket, the same scuffed shoes, the same limp. Behind him, a massive screen was set up. He began speaking without notes. Yesterday, a woman walked into my lobby. I recognized her. 35 years ago, she stood silent while her husband accused a 10-year-old boy of theft. I was that boy. I have never forgotten her face. He gestured, and the screen showed the surveillance footage from the lobby. Diane dismissing the shabby man, then lavishing attention on the businessman. Gasps rippled through the audience. He continued, voice steady but edged with emotion. Today, I learned that the same woman was hired by my business rival, Aldrich Finch, to manufacture a scandal. She threatened to expose my mother's alleged criminal past. He paused. My mother's name was Maria Kessler. When she was 22, she was convicted of stealing money she never took. She was a poor immigrant who didn't speak English well enough to defend herself. Her employer forced a confession to cover for the owner's nephew. She served 6 months, came out, changed her name, and built a life for her son on nothing but honesty. He clicked to a document projected on the screen. The original appeal letter, handwritten in broken English from a county archive. Then a recent affidavit from the nephew, now an elderly man living in a retirement home, confessing on camera that he had stolen the items and that his uncle had framed Maria. Alex's crew had recorded the confession just that morning after tracking him down. This is the truth, John said. I am not ashamed of my mother. She was a victim, not a criminal. And I refuse to let her legacy be a weapon in a corporate war. The room was silent now, but a different silence than before. Not accusation, but absorption. He then announced that he would be launching a foundation in his mother's name to fund legal defense for wrongly convicted women. He was taking the attack and turning it into a legacy. The press conference ended with Angela, the young woman from the lobby who had seen him differently, standing and applauding. Others joined. But the payoff wasn't finished. As John stepped away from the podium, his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. We just got word. Aldrich Finch is being investigated by the SEC for market manipulation. The tip came from an insider who used to work for him. It seems his own house is falling. John smiled, not with vengeance, but with release. The final reckoning was about to begin. Within 48 hours of John Matherson's press conference, the public narrative had turned inside out. The stock price that had opened 12 points down not only recovered, but surged 14 points above its previous close. The confession of the real thief from nearly half a century ago, captured on video and verified by legal experts, transformed the story from a corporate scandal into a deeply human triumph. The hashtag, I am Maria, began trending on social media, driven by thousands of people sharing their own stories of being judged unfairly. But the true reckoning was only beginning. Aldrich Finch's carefully constructed empire was shaking. The SEC investigation that had begun as a quiet inquiry now expanded into a full probe. A former Clifford Holdings accountant, a woman named Selena Ortiz, went public with documents proving that Finch had orchestrated a pattern of similar smear campaigns against acquisition targets. He had paid operatives, often vulnerable people with grudges, to seed damaging narratives. Diane Ashford was not the first weapon he had deployed. She was simply the most personal one for John. Within a week, Clifford Holdings board convened an emergency session and voted unanimously to remove Finch as CEO. The market value of his personal holdings dropped by $200 million in a single day. Lawyers lined up to file class action suits on behalf of shareholders who had been misled. Finch, cornered, issued a statement that called the allegations baseless, but offered no evidence. His voice, which had once dripped with condescension over the phone line, now sounded hollow and frantic on voicemails he left for John that were never returned. Diane Ashford's fate was quieter but no less consequential. After her recorded conversation with Finch was leaked to federal investigators, she was charged with conspiracy to commit securities fraud and defamation with malice. She faced up to 10 years in prison. But John, in a move that surprised even his closest advisors, asked the prosecutor to offer her a plea deal, probation, community service, and a permanent injunction against contacting him or his family. He didn't do it out of forgiveness for Diane. He did it because he understood that she had been a tool of a much larger predator. In his words, "I will not become the man who destroys the weak to prove he is strong." That statement, published in a follow-up interview, solidified his public image as a leader of principle, not just profit. But the deepest resolution was not legal or financial. It came one morning, a few days after the press conference, when John visited his mother's grave. He had not been there in almost a year. The headstone was simple: Maria Kessler Matherson, beloved mother. He stood in the quiet cemetery, the same worn tweed jacket hanging on his shoulders, and he spoke aloud to the stone. "I know the truth now. You never told me because you wanted me to be free of that mark, but I would have carried it with you." He wept for the first time in decades, not from grief, but from the release of a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. His mother's silence had been a shield, and now he could honor her story openly. The foundation he announced took shape with remarkable speed. The Maria Kessler Justice Project launched with an initial endowment of $50 million, dedicated to exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals and providing legal defense for those who could not afford it. The first case the foundation took on was that of a 27-year-old single mother accused of theft at a retail chain, a case that eerily mirrored his mother. With top attorneys funded by the project, the charges were dropped within a month, and the store issued a public apology. John attended the hearing and sat quietly in the back, unrecognized until the woman's lawyer pointed him out. The woman, tears in her eyes, mouthed, "Thank you." John later said it was the most important hearing he had ever attended. Meanwhile, the woman from the lobby, the one whose initial assumptions had set the entire story in motion, re-entered John's life in an unexpected way. Her name was Angela Vance. She was a retired humanities professor, and she had been in the hotel that day to meet a friend. After the story broke, she saw John's face on the news and recognized him immediately as the man she had pitied in the lobby. Stricken with guilt, she wrote him a letter. It was handwritten on cream-colored stationery, 4 pages long, detailing how she had spent her life judging people by their clothing, their posture, the subtle markers of status. She confessed that she had nearly walked over to him that day to offer help, thinking he was a lost, confused man who didn't belong. "I would have been kind," she wrote, "but my kindness would have been soaked in condescension. I saw you as someone beneath me, and I was wrong, more wrong than I can express." John invited Angela to his office. She arrived expecting cold professionalism, but instead he poured her a cup of coffee and sat with her for over an hour. He told her about his mother, about the lobby test he had been running for years, and about the danger of assuming a person's worth from their appearance. He asked her to join the advisory board of his foundation, not as a donor, but as someone who could help design educational programs to challenge hidden bias. Angela, overwhelmed, accepted. She later described the moment as the most redemptive of my life. Their unlikely partnership became a symbol of the documentary's closing theme, that the people we overlook are often the ones who hold the most power to change us. The young reporter Renee Voss also underwent a transformation. She had been used by Finch's operation to publish the initial hit piece, but after John's press conference, she realized she had been manipulated. Instead of retreating, she dug deeper. Her subsequent investigation uncovered new evidence that helped the SEC build its case against Finch. She wrote a 5-part series for the Chronicle titled The Lobby Test, which won a regional journalism award and raised her profile nationally. She later confessed in an interview that she had nearly become part of the problem, and John's decision to tell the truth without attacking her personally had saved her career. She and John remained in contact, and within a year, she would ghostwrite a memoir about his mother. But the final surprising detail, the one that even John didn't expect, came from an old storage unit in the town where he grew up. While clearing out the last of his mother's belongings after the foundation launched, a sealed box was found behind a false wall in the back of her closet. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, written in a language John didn't recognize. He hired a translator and discovered they were from his maternal grandmother, whom Maria had told him died before he was born. The letters revealed that his grandmother had been a political prisoner in her home country, arrested for speaking against corruption. She had survived 8 years before escaping to a neighboring country, where she lived in obscurity until her death years later. Maria had hidden the letters to protect her son from the weight of that legacy. John realized then that the courage he had admired in his mother was generational, a thread of resilience woven through the women of his family long before the lobby, before the motel, before the empire. This discovery deepened his commitment. The Maria Kessler Justice Project expanded its mission to support families of political prisoners seeking asylum. John announced the expansion at a gala held in the very ballroom where he had faced the cameras just months earlier. Standing on the stage, he said, "My mother taught me that a person's worth is not determined by the worst thing that happened to them, nor by the worst thing someone says about them. She taught me that silence can be a fortress, but truth is the only key." Today, we open that door for others. The documentary then turned toward its final act, a reflection on the power of perception, the danger of quick judgment, and the quiet revolution that begins when someone, like the woman in the lobby, learns to see beyond the worn coat. What John Matherson's story leaves us with is not just a billionaire's revenge or a corporate takedown. It leaves us with a mirror. That moment in a marble lobby, the split-second judgment, the quiet dismissal, happens everywhere, every day in lobbies of all kinds. We scan clothes, we read shoes, we size up posture, and in that fraction of a heartbeat, we decide who matters and who can be ignored. The woman in the hotel that day was not a monster. She was, in many ways, ordinary. She had her own struggles, her own reasons for seeing the world as a hierarchy, and the man she overlooked was, by every visible measure, forgettable. Worn coat, scuffed shoes, a slight limp, no entourage, no confidence that announced itself. Yet inside that unremarkable shell was a person who had clawed his way from poverty, who had been falsely accused as a child, who carried a mother's silent sacrifice across decades, and who had built a fortune not by stepping on others, but by insisting on seeing people more clearly than the world had ever seen him. That is the paradox. The people we most easily dismiss are often the ones who hold the deepest stories. The quiet stranger in the coffee shop, the shy coworker in the back cubicle, the elderly neighbor whose clothes are out of fashion. Every single one of them has survived something. Every single one contains a world. Angela Vance, the woman from the lobby, spent her entire career teaching students to analyze texts, yet she had never truly read the people around her. Her confession letter became a quiet manifesto. "I spent a lifetime curating kindness for those who looked worthy, and I called that virtue. I didn't realize that genuine decency doesn't sort by appearance." She now speaks at the Foundation's events, sharing that humility with audiences across the country. Her presence is a living reminder that change is possible, even late in life. John himself, for all his wealth, found his truest wealth not in the 42nd floor penthouse, but in the moment he stood before his mother's grave and finally let himself break. He had spent decades trying to prove himself to a world that had once called him a thief, but healing came when he stopped trying to prove anything at all. He now wears that same worn coat to board meetings, not as a test anymore, but as a tribute. A tribute to the woman who cleaned rooms and hid her pain so he could dream. A tribute to the truth that a label stitched on a jacket says nothing about the fabric of the person inside. So the next time you find yourself in a lobby, whether it's made of marble or linoleum, and you see someone who looks out of place, pause. That flicker of judgment you feel, it's a door. You can walk through it with old assumptions, or you can open it and discover a story that might change you. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel for more documentaries that uncover the extraordinary truths hidden in ordinary moments. Thank you for watching.